Welcome to Emma's senior oral. Emma has been my senior assistant this year, and she has helped out with Old Testament and my Rhetoric 2 class. So she's been a treasure. Joining me on the panel is Mr. Chase Acuff and Leah McQueen, and I am Dara Rogers, and we are just so excited to hear from Emma today. Y'all can be seated. Oh, I guess I'll pray too. Father, thank you for bringing us here today. Thank you for Emma and her hard work and her dedication to this oral. We pray that you will be with her as she speaks and amongst our conversation today. In your name, amen.
A man has fallen ill and died. His name was Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, he who was loved by Jesus. When Lazarus first fell ill, his sister sent to Jesus, saying, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard this, he did not rush back to Judea, but instead stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. When Jesus and his disciples finally arrived, he found that his dear friend Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Martha heard that Jesus was coming and went out to meet him, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She called her sister Mary to come see Jesus as well. And when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." One of Jesus' dearest friends had died. Sadness, grief, weeping, these are all proper emotional responses in this situation. Emotion is an innate human experience. All of us have experienced emotion, and most of us have experienced sadness specifically. But what is sadness? What are emotions really? Where do they come from? How are they created in the human body? And most importantly, why were we created with the ability to feel emotion? To discover the answers to these questions, we must first understand what it is that we are feeling when we experience emotion and where that feeling comes from. We must first answer, what are emotions and how are they made? In pursuit of a scientific answer, I read the book How Emotions Are Made by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, professor of psychology at Northeastern University. In Dr. Barrett's book, she explains the theory of constructed emotion. Her theory asserts that emotions are not simply reactions that we have to the world, and they are not universally the same. Instead, emotions are constructed when your brain uses past experience organized as concepts to give meaning to the physical stimuli it receives. Emotions are not a reaction triggered by events in the world, but rather are an active component in your very perception of the events themselves. To further explain the way our brains perceive the world, we must look at our surroundings. The world is full of sights, sounds, colors, smells, tastes, textures, feelings. Our brains are not equipped to process all the stimuli they are receiving at any given moment. If we could experience everything perceived by our senses simultaneously, it would be so overwhelming to our brains that we would be unable to function. Instead, we process our surroundings through concepts. But what is a concept? A concept is a categorization created by the mind in order to better understand the world. When a baby is born, they have 0 concepts and thus perceive their surroundings solely through their 5 senses. They perceive light and shape with their eyes, but do not understand what it is that they are seeing. One of the first concepts we learn as babies is that of a person, usually our mother or father. Once we've learned this concept, when we look at our mother or father, we no longer perceive merely shape and color, but a person and a face. As we age, we add more and more concepts to our repertoire, which allow us to better understand our surroundings. As a teenager or adult, we know hundreds of thousands of concepts, allowing us to quickly and efficiently perceive our surroundings. When we walk into a room like this library with a table and chairs, it takes a fraction of a second for us to recognize them for what they are. When we perceive those chairs, our brain receives visual stimuli, light, shape, and color, and uses our previously learned concepts of a table and chairs to understand what we're seeing. Our eyes allow us to see, but concepts create meaning from our sight. And this principle applies to our other 4 senses as well. When we hear someone speak a sentence, we as listeners utilize our concept of language, as well as the concepts for each individual word in order to understand the meaning of the sentence. This process of categorization into concepts happens so quickly that it feels simultaneous to the reception of the physical stimuli themselves. This creates a practically seamless perception of the world in which we rapidly recognize and categorize our surroundings. This is how we understand the world through concepts. But how is recognizing a table and chairs or a spoken sentence through concepts relevant to the creation of emotions within the brain? These two instances are strikingly similar to emotional perception in the way our brain perceives them. Just as with the table and chairs, we use our concepts to understand what we're seeing, so with emotion, we use emotional concepts to understand what we are feeling physically. Barrett puts it this way: in every waking moment, your brain uses past experience, organizes concepts to guide your actions and give your sensations meaning. When the concepts involved are emotion concepts, your brain constructs instances of emotions. Concepts are the foundation on which emotional experiences are built. Fear, sadness, joy, anger, etc. are all built out of emotional concepts. For example, if our stomach feels uneasy and we're about to take an important test, we may perceive that stomachache as nervousness, whereas a stomachache during an argument may feel like anger. This contrast occurs because the emotion is not solely the physical feeling of a stomachache, but rather your brain's interpretation of the stomachache through context, concepts, and past experience. Instances of emotion occur when physical feelings are interpreted in the context of the situation, but where do the physical feelings come from in the first place? The answer is that physical feelings and instances of emotion occur based on two things: affect and prediction. Barrett describes affect as the general sense of feeling that you experience throughout each day. It is not emotion, but a much simpler feeling with two features. The first is how pleasant or unpleasant you feel, which scientists call valence. The second feature of affect is how calm or agitated you feel, which is called activation. This idea is displayed on the affective circumplex. At any point in time, we're somewhere on the affective circumplex. We're always experiencing some combination of pleasant or unpleasant valence and intense or mild activation. This combination creates our affect, the basis of physical feeling. The second aspect of physical feeling is prediction. Not prediction in the sense of prophecy, but rather our body's prediction of what we need based on a situation. For example, if we see a snake or something else that we fear, our body will most likely predict that we need our heart to beat faster and we need adrenaline. We can physically feel our adrenal gland release the hormone, and we can feel our position on the affective circumplex changing as the level of activation in our body rises. Let's look at the affective circumplex in the instance of our stomachache example. In both the instance of the test and the argument, we would most likely be about here on the circumplex. Very unpleasant valence due to the pain of the stomachache, and relatively high activation due to the circumstance. The affective circumplex shows that these two instances cause the same physical feeling in the body, but are interpreted differently based on the context. This process holds true for all circumstances. Our physical feelings are based on affect, adjusted by prediction, and interpreted using concepts, sometimes into an instance of emotion. Let us recap these ideas in the context of the story of Lazarus. People react to sudden loss in many different ways, so it is impossible to know the exact physiological response that Jesus experienced in the wake of Lazarus' death, or where he was on the affective circumplex at that moment. He might have experienced a rush of adrenaline, he may have felt nauseous, or even numbness. But regardless of what physical feeling was created in his body, his brain used the context of the situation to interpret the physical stimuli from the body as an experience of the emotion sadness. Mary, Martha, and Jesus had a physiological response to an event, the loss of a loved one, which their brains interpreted based on their situation and experiences as the emotion sadness. Jesus is fully God, but he was also fully man, and as a man, he experienced the innate human affair of emotion. Definition made, now the thesis question. Why were we created to feel emotion? For an answer, I interviewed LPC Jody Goley. She had this to say about the matter. As Christians and as people, emotions are absolutely necessary. Without emotion, there is no purpose, no meaning, and no basis for relationships. We were created with emotions because the ability to feel allows us to relate to others on a deeper level and to feel a deeper connection to our God. Emotions provide the basis for empathy, which is key to relationships. Oxford defines empathy as the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. Psychology coach Derek Carpenter writes, "Empathy is a powerful force that helps maintain social order and cooperation. It is the mechanism that allows people to understand and relate to others. Empathy is a necessary precursor to intimacy, trust, and belonging. It is also the feeling that makes it difficult to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. Intimacy, trust, belonging. Are these not three of the most fundamental parts of relationship? And all three stem from emotion, from the ability to feel and understand the emotions of others. Without emotion, relationships are unattainable. If we were completely devoid of emotion, we would be unable to feel and unable to love. We were created intentionally to feel emotion, because it is the basis for all meaningful relationships with others and with our Creator. Empathy allows us to understand the pain Jesus went through when he died for our sin, and the sorrow the Father felt when he sent his Son to the cross. Emotions allow us to feel these truths and to understand the love our God has for us. They drive us to want to know him, to be in relationship with him. This is why we were created to feel emotion. Not only is our ability to feel important, but it is also beneficial for us to understand our emotions and how they work. In my interview with Ms. Goley, I asked her what benefit she sees as a result of her clients understanding their emotions. She said that she sees the benefit of her clients understanding their emotions because it allows them to process why they feel the way they do, create coping tools, and eventually move on. It allows them to feel, think, act, rather than feel, act, think. This process of feeling, understanding our feelings, thinking, and then acting is crucial to relationships, and is possible only through an understanding of emotion. Understanding our emotions is a form of honesty with ourselves and others. It allows us to better understand ourselves and others, and it allows for more intentional relationships. Stoics may argue that emotion is not necessary for a fulfilling life, that minimizing one's emotions leads to peace, that feeling and understanding emotions deeply does not compare to the tranquility of Stoicism. However, when Mary and Martha tell Jesus the news of their brother's death, and when they weep, Jesus weeps with them. Seeing their sorrow, Jesus wept. Our Savior himself feels empathy and emotion. He can relate to Mary and Martha in their heartbreak because he too feels what they feel. His understanding of their emotions and his compassion for them allows a deeper relationship to be formed. If Jesus had displayed stoicism in this instance, would it have built relationship? Would his later miracle have been as meaningful? We were created to feel emotion because it is the basis of all meaningful relationships. Without it, we have no purpose, no hope, no depth of personhood. We were given the gift of emotion, of feeling, to connect with our Creator and with our fellow humans who are made in his image. Thank you.
Wonderful job. You did
Thank
so
you.
great. All right. What are your plans for next year?
I am going to Texas A&M University, and I'm planning on doing pre-nursing.
Okay, pre-nursing. So did that influence your selection of the topic, or maybe along the way did the topic help you decide that?
Well, maybe somewhat. I chose this topic because I'm a very emotional and very empathetic person, so I wanted to understand more about that. And I actually think that empathy might not help me in the field of nursing, maybe somewhat, but it also might make it more difficult in some ways.
Okay, why so?
Just because I think I would probably be working with a lot of people who are struggling and undergoing hard things, and that might be a little bit harder for someone who's very empathetic.
Yeah, for sure. So you told us why you picked your topic. What were your initial kind of steps in deciding how you were going to go about answering such a kind of abstract
Well,
idea?
it took me a long time to figure out what I was going to say, because I figured out my thesis question, which is, why were we created to feel emotion, before I figured out the answer, like a month later. So the first step was choosing the book, How Emotions Are Made, and so that just kind of explains the connection between the body, like the physical, and the emotion, but it doesn't include the soul, which I think we're probably going to talk about in this interview. I'm a little nervous. But
We'll get there.
after I read that book and I understood more about what emotions are and how they're created in the body, then I just talked to a lot of people, and especially my interview with Ms. Goley, I ended up coming to the conclusion that emotions, the main purpose is relationship.
Great.
Sorry, that's a long answer.
Yep, no, that's great. Tells us a lot. So why are relationships so important?
Well, I think we as humans are created for relationship. If you think about, like, one of the worst punishments that we give to someone besides the death penalty is solitary confinement, because we are beings who are created to be in relationship. It's just the way we were designed.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's talk about Jesus and Lazarus. I think that story is very impactful into revealing how important emotions are.
For sure.
So, my favorite line, and you know this, we've talked about this, is that it says, Jesus, was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. So, what about Jesus and how he uses emotions, what does that reveal about his humanity?
Well, I think it reveals some things about his humanity and also ours, because a lot of time emotion can be viewed as a negative thing because it does cause some problems, but seeing that Jesus, I said, like one of the lines in my paper is, our Savior himself felt empathy and emotion. I think we can see that it is something that is good. And then as for what it says about his humanity, I guess just that even though he was also fully God, and even though he knew what was going to happen, he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he still felt that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, because if he was God and he already knew the outcome, why do you think that his reaction matters so much? That he, was moved and he wept?
Well, I think because it says a lot about Jesus and how he went about relationships. Mm-hmm. He ate with sinners and with prostitutes and with people that other Christians or Jews at that time looked down upon, because he was a relational person. And so he didn't think of himself as better than other people. He wasn't like, oh, Mary and Martha, y'all are idiots. I'm about to raise your brother from the dead. He
didn't say that.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been, I probably wouldn't have written this paper if he had. But he chose to empathize with them and to feel with them and to weep with them.
Yeah, that's good. Do you think, so he's fully man, and with our idea of the emotional concepts and all of the scientific research that's done behind emotions, do you think that his emotions, he learned emotional concepts just like everybody else did?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to talk about statistical learning. So the way that babies learn concepts, or the way that people learn concepts, when babies are first born and they don't understand what anything is, like I said, they perceive the world solely through their five senses. The way that they start to learn concepts is by frequency. Mm-hmm. So the way they learn the concept of words is they pick up on, subconsciously, obviously they're not thinking about it, but they learn the frequency of this sound coming after this sound, and they learn that that's one word together. And then they can learn the frequency, this word is often associated with this action or with this person. That's how they learn the phrase mom or dad. And so the same thing is true of emotional concepts, the way that babies learn. A lot of little kids' TV shows, if you see, there are very simple portrayals of emotion of sadness, happiness, or even when a baby cries, you might say oh, are you sad? Or baby's laughing, you're oh, you're happy. And that's how they begin to learn the basis of what emotional concepts mean. And so obviously I don't know what Jesus was like as a baby. I don't know. It's really hard to think about the fact that he could be all-knowing and also a baby who's so vulnerable and not knowing. And so I don't know if that is the way that he learned emotional concepts, but I would say that is the way a human would learn emotional concepts.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and good job not trying to paint a picture of Jesus that we don't necessarily know. So.
Might not be a good idea.
So what can we learn then from just how he handled interactions, how he handled anger and how he handled sadness and other positive emotions too?
Yeah.
What can humans, plebeians, learn?
One thing we can learn is that emotions are not negative. The ability to feel itself is good, and everything else, like all good things, emotions can be corrupted. Evil is corrupted good, and so emotions can be corrupted also. But the fact that Jesus felt all those emotions, he didn't just feel happiness and joy, but he felt anger and he felt sorrow, and it shows that those things are not inherently bad, that those things are necessary and they are good when they're used appropriately.
That's great. Okay, so you also said that he experienced an innately human affair. So this might be a hard question, but do our cats love us?
Yes, I think they do. I choose to believe that my cat loves me. And I also, I thought a lot about what love is and whether it's a feeling and whether it's an emotion. And what I have concluded is that love is an action that is not necessarily just an emotion and not necessarily just a feeling. And it's also not necessarily just physical, but I think that it's an action that is taken in the soul, which you're more than welcome to disagree with me, because that is just the conclusion I've come to. I don't know if it's right. And then there's also a big debate over whether animals have souls.
Especially cats. So.
I think that they do. I choose to believe that my cat does have a soul and that he does love me.
I think we'll just choose to believe that for now. So, okay.
I can't help but agree with you. I have a dog who is seems to get genuinely depressed when I'm not around.
Yeah.
It's like, this animal loves me.
Yes, I think animals do have emotions.
And so it's pretty cool. So I kind of want to follow up on one of the questions that you asked, and the response of the statistical learning of concepts. Why do you think it's the case then that so many concepts seem to come about almost like the same way for everyone? Like everyone seems to have the similar concept of sadness. If it was just sort of statistical probability, I feel like we might get more variability. So how do you explain that?
Well, one thing is that a lot of us grow up in similar ways. So you see that, like I said, with like the TV shows or with people's parents, I think that a lot of I think that emotional concepts and emotions are different. So I think that emotional concepts are how we understand our emotions, but the emotion itself, I think, would occur even if we didn't have the understanding of what the emotional concept is. And I think that's also the reason that you see people a lot of times you see like psychopaths or people who end up being serial killers. They had very, very traumatic childhoods. And so I think they didn't learn. I don't think they did learn the same emotional concepts. They didn't learn how to express emotions in a healthy way as children. I don't know if that answers.
That's extremely interesting that you can have the sensation of an emotion and not be able to know what exactly is going on because you don't have a concept of it. So very, very interesting. And also, well done as well.
Thank you.
I was just got too excited to ask the question.
Thank
you. I've been thinking about these questions all week because it's incredibly engaging.
Okay, that's good.
Very interesting stuff.
It's good.
So you already predicted one of my questions. Is love a feeling or a decision?
Yes.
You said it was an action.
Yes.
So one of my questions along with that, how do you think, like in this system of sort of constructing emotion, a choice that you make or an action that you take produces an emotion or an emotional response?
Right, so I think that love is separate from, I don't think it is an emotion, but I think it can cause emotions. So like, for example, with the cat example, I love my cat. And so when I see him, it causes emotions because I love him and I have a concept of what he is. So when I see him, I recognize him. And because I love him, then it causes like the emotion joy in my mind and in my body.
Okay. So it's like the choice itself is a stimuli.
Yes. Yes, I would say so.
Or stimulus.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the soul then. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus says, my soul is sorrowful to the point of death. And in Philippians, Paul tells us, that we can receive the peace that surpasses understanding.
I have that in my notes.
So how do you reconcile these sort of like soulful experiences with this like system of physically grounded emotional processing?
Yes, so that is a very good question. I think that the soul is the self, which we talk a lot about what the soul is in a lot of our classes. And so the soul is like the essence of a being, I think. You can disagree if you want, and then I'll cry that you disagreed with me.
So.
Okay. But I think that because the soul is like the essence of ourself, when we feel an emotion in our body, we also feel it in our soul. I think that everything that we feel, maybe not like a tiny emotion like you're annoyed because you stubbed your toe, but like the emotion, the sorrow that you talked about, I think with emotions like that, you can feel them in the soul. And then also, I know we talked about this a lot in your office, and I have decided that I do think that you can perceive emotions in your soul before you perceive them in the body. I don't think it always like comes from the physical world. I think that you can perceive emotion first in your soul.
Interesting. Because I don't have an answer. I mean, it's a hard question. I think that's a really good response. I also think it is interesting how the soul and the body have those parallels. Right? That they sort of they don't seem to be separable. Which is perhaps why we'll have a resurrected body. Like we will always have a body.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely part of it. So I'll pass the mic. I have many more questions, but
oh no.
Return.
Okay, I don't know what's going to make you more uncomfortable, talking about the soul or talking about you.
Probably me.
So you have told all of us that you are a very emotional person, and she told me in my office I was unemotional. So
you said it first. I don't know why you're trying to.
So I've decided this is the perfect pair.
Oh, yeah.
So can you give us some examples of times when your emotions have harmed you? And examples of times when they have benefited you?
Yes, I can. Okay, this is something that comes to mind. It's not like a super intense example of emotion, but it is something that's negative. Definitely in sports, I can get very emotional, like, especially whenever I was younger and I started playing club volleyball when I was in 6th grade, and I had a really intense coach, and so I was very fearful of her, and it made me very emotional. Like, going to practice, I would cry before practice, and that honestly just wasn't necessary. It wasn't like she was going to physically beat me up at the gym, so I didn't like need to have those emotions, and it made me probably unnecessarily anxious to go to practice, and it did also probably make me perform worse than I would have if I had just been like not as upset about it. I don't know if that's a good example.
I think that's a great example. I mean, do you think, though, it sounds a little bit like you're being hard on yourself, like your 7th grade self just shouldn't have had these emotions? When, I mean, that seems perfectly justified.
Right, and I think it is justified, but still maybe not beneficial. Like, I think that was probably the correct emotional response for, like, a 12-year-old girl, but it still probably wasn't beneficial to my volleyball playing.
Okay, so what about when you were 14? Would you have that same kind of...
Would I have reacted the same way? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Probably not, because by that time I think I was a little bit more used to playing and used to sports, and I had matured somewhat, and I wasn't as sensitive at that point, so probably not, no.
Okay, so so I feel like sports does bring out the best and worst of people emotionally.
I would agree.
So can you give us an example outside of that?
Of a time when emotions are negative to me? I mean, I have 3 siblings, so I've had my fair share of arguing growing up, and especially with my sister Phoebe, who I shared a room with for like the first 16 years of my life, we could get very emotional and very irritated at each other, and especially like unnecessary anger, like sometimes just things she would do would anger me even though it wasn't necessarily justified, and that could be harmful to our relationship.
Okay. All right, so what are some ways your emotions have benefited you?
Okay, definitely in relationships, especially with people who have like gone through or experienced similar things that I have, because I think that being very emotional and very empathetic has made me good at comforting people and understanding their emotions and listening and talking to people who are emotional. That is probably the biggest thing that makes me thankful for being emotional.
Do you think that, if the nursing thing is what you pursue, because, I mean, you're young, you could always change your mind. Do you think that would benefit you in any way?
I mean, I know that if I was like really sick, or something that I thought about is like if I were having a child in a hospital, I would want an empathetic nurse. I wouldn't want someone who like doesn't care what happens to me. Not that people who aren't empathetic don't care what's happening to you. Sorry to my non-empathetic sister who's being a nurse, but not that she won't care what is happening to people. But I think it would be nice to have someone who like is very invested and really does care how you feel and how you feel emotionally, even though I think that would be very draining for them.
And that was going to be my follow-up question.
Okay.
Like, I know you're a long ways from that.
Yes.
But do you think that you will have to learn how to kind of not separate, that's not a good word, but kind of be able to leave those things at work and come home?
I definitely think so. Especially, I want to be a NICU nurse. I do love babies a lot. And I think that would be very hard if, you're going to see a lot of sad things if that's your job. And so I think I will have to learn how to, not let those things consume me.
Yeah, that's good. So kind of along the same lines, and you've kind of answered this already, but I'm curious about some of the how. So, do you feel like understanding your emotions and learning to channel them correctly has been something you've had to work pretty hard on, or does that come pretty easy?
No, it does not come pretty easy. It is definitely something I've had to learn and something that I'm still learning, and it's taking a long time. But it might come naturally to some people. I think most people who are emotional, it doesn't come very naturally to.
And, I mean, maybe the other way around, too. For someone, we actually discussed in my office that actually I'm not all that unemotional. I just don't let people see it that often.
Yes.
Which, you know, that's another thing that maybe we'll get into. But I think it might be hard for them, too.
Yes, definitely.
Anyway, so are there some specific things that you have done along the way to learn to understand them and control them, so to speak? I don't really like the control word, but I can't think of a better word right now.
Well, yes, it's been a long process. One thing that actually was very beneficial to me in understanding my emotions was reading the book for my thesis, How Emotions Are Made, especially talking about the affective circumplex. It's so interesting because if you ever have a feeling like, oh, I'm anxious, but I don't know what I'm anxious about, a lot of times, actually, that is just a physical feeling in your body, and you aren't anxious. You just have that feeling. And so understanding that emotion is, in large part, a physical thing has been very helpful in dealing with your emotions.
Okay. So, I don't even remember when this came out, but one thing I wanted you to know, and really everyone who's done an oral this week, is you've learned a lot in this process, but you teach us a lot in this process too. And so I have also thought a lot about your paper since I read it about a week and a half ago, and I've kind of started noticing some things that I don't think I would have noticed before. So
nice.
I mean, good job on making us deal with maybe some of our own things.
Thank you. You're welcome.
All right. I have one more question, then I'm going to pass it on. Do you think the incident with Lazarus' death, this is purely theoretical. I know we don't know an answer.
Okay.
It's just for interest.
Okay.
Do you think that was the only time Jesus cried?
I'm going to say probably not. I would think that because like we talked about, he was fully God and fully man, and he experienced emotion just as fully as people do. I don't know anyone who has only cried once in their life. I also think when he was a baby, he probably would have cried.
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking of that, but yes.
I would say yes, I think he cried more.
Yeah, I just think of usually it wasn't people who were in great shape coming to him.
True.
It was broken people. And how do you look at that brokenness and not cry?
For sure.
And not experience that kind of emotion. So that's something I'd never thought about before either. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, to follow up with what Mrs. McQueen was saying, when Emma first introduced the topic, the first couple months, I had to have her repeat concepts to me multiple times. So I'm like, girl, I'm nowhere near where you are right now, but we're going to get there together. So, and hopefully we kind of did, but there are still questions. So, so we talked about the
affective circumplex.
Yes, circumplex. Point proven. Where are you on it right in this moment?
Oh, can I? Let's see. Maybe
Test your
here.
So fear and what? Or
Alarmed, which also that's kind of misleading because affect and emotion are two separate things, and so but that one was just a nice color, and I thought pretty easy to understand. So. It's not that affect and emotion are the same. It's that whenever you're at that place on the affective circumplex, it's likely that you're feeling that emotion.
okay. So is there an ideal place that you think people want to be on it?
Definitely on the pleasant side.
Okay.
And I guess it depends on the person because some people are like thrill seekers and they love roller coasters, so they would probably want to be higher activation, and some people just like to hang out and be on the beach and read books, and so they would probably want to be lower. But I think everyone wants to be on the pleasant side of the valence.
Pleasant side, and then in your everyday life, do you always want to be on a roller coaster if you're a normal human?
No, definitely not.
So I guess maybe I'm trying to see it from a perspective of like a stoic, of somebody who's pursuing kind of what you're talking about, pursuing this peace through emotions or things that might trigger emotions.
Yes.
Why wouldn't we want to just be at peace all the time?
Well, I don't think everything about Stoicism is incorrect. I do think that a lot of it is very wise. I also don't want Jake Inglestad to come be mad at me because he did his thesis on Stoicism last year. But I think that being at peace is good, but also I think when you're like very focused on just feeling peaceful and not ever feeling like negative emotions fully, you also kind of numb yourself to a lot of positive emotions fully. Yeah. I think you can't have no pain and then still have all the joy.
Okay. So, how can people, us everyday folk, use this tool to help build better relationships? What can we really take away from it that matters?
From that specifically? I mean, I think that it can be helpful for understanding other people's emotions. So in the empathy category, especially for someone who has a hard time understanding what their emotions are or expressing it, this can be a helpful tool to like figure out, where am I right now? What am I feeling right now? And then that can help them communicate to other people what they're feeling. And obviously that can help you understand each other and build a relationship.
Yeah, and you said communication is part of a really beneficial relationship.
Yes, that's Callie's thesis.
Great. Okay, so let's talk about empathy. You talked about some of your relationships with your siblings and in other areas of life where empathy is going to be important. Is it ever hard for you to be empathetic?
I would say no. Just because of who I am. And that's not necessarily a good thing. You can definitely be overly empathetic to the point that it makes your life more difficult because it's very overwhelming to feel two people's emotions at once. And so I would definitely fall farther onto that side of the excess rather than deficiency.
Talking about the golden mean.
Yes, Aristotle's golden mean.
Well, we brought it up. I was worried we wouldn't be able to. we got there. So what if you're not you and you're somebody who's naturally has a hard time with empathy? What would you tell that person? Do you tell them to be more empathetic, or do they have to realize that themselves, or do they just...
I think that everyone has some level of empathy. And so I think for people who naturally have like a lower level of empathy, they definitely still have some, and it's something that you can work on, and you can be intentional in trying to understand other people's emotions. Even though with empathy, especially somatic empathy, you feel other people's emotions. If that's not you, you can still understand other people's emotions, and you can sympathize rather than empathize.
That's good. Great. So I have one more thought process. You talked a little bit about the servant leadership feel, think, act, which is another thing that's been brought up a good bit. So that means something, right? That everyone remembers that as a tool. Why is that tool so important for building relationships?
Well, like Callie's thesis talked about, something that's really important to relationships is honest communication. And when you feel and then you act before you think, you're not communicating as honestly as you can if you feel and then think. Because when you feel, then you can think about why you feel the way you do. And you can be, like I said, understanding your emotions is a form of honesty with yourself. And so understanding your emotions allows you to be more honest with the people that you're in a relationship with.
Okay. So what if, take for example, you're really angry about something and you've thought about it and you still think you're justified in your anger, even if it might not be for the right reason. You've thought about it and then you act. What do you do with that? Like, what has to happen for us to act appropriately?
So if you've thought about it and you still feel justified in your anger, and maybe you are justified, you can still choose to interact with people in a way that maybe isn't your full force of anger. You can choose to interact with them in a way that is more kind and more loving, even if that's not how you feel.
So what plays a role in the thinking process? Is it all reason, or is there emotion involved in the thinking process?
I think there's emotion involved in maybe the interacting process, because even if you are angry, that's emotion. But then also you can empathize and understand that the other person is also probably emotional, and they're also a human who is created in God's image. So you can empathize with them and understand, like, they don't want to be yelled at because I'm angry, and maybe that can help you interact in a calm way.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, my last line of thinking that we didn't really get to talk about before, but I just want to get your opinion on it. So we kind of seem to be in a culture that is very feelings oriented,
yes.
right? Would you say that our culture, and here in the United States, is mostly guided by reason or feelings? And this is an opinion question because I don't know if it was necessarily in your book. But.
Probably feelings, because feeling is easier than thinking. It's a lot easier to do, and it's a lot easier to act on. So I would say definitely probably feeling, but that is also probably not the way that it would ideally be.
Okay. I was just curious. So have you, and this maybe is part of how you answered some of Mrs. McQueen's questions, but have you noticed a change in how you handle your emotions these last couple of months going through this process?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Just because of, like I said, reading the book was very enlightening because there's a lot that I could talk about that I read in the book, and I think everyone should read it. It is so interesting. But yes, I just learned a lot about myself and about the way people feel.
And what has this process taught you about your Creator and your relationship with God?
Well, it just has shown even more how intentionally we were created, I think, is the main thing. That emotion was not like an accident, and it's not something that just happened. It's something that we were created for. That's why my thesis is called Created to Feel.
Created to Feel. Great. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so I have, I want to take some time to break down some terms from the affective circumplex.
Okay.
Mostly for the audience.
Okay.
Because there's just only so much time, right? So when you say affect, what does that refer to?
So that is the basis of physical feeling. So it's the feeling in your body at all times. Everyone has affect at all times of the day. And so it's like, there's the two parts of it. There's pleasant and unpleasant. So, and then there's activation, high or low. And so it's just like how hyped up or not hyped up you feel, and then how good or bad you feel.
So this activation is the arousal or the stimulation.
Yes.
Right? So affect, pleasant, unpleasant, and then activation, high or low.
It's valence, pleasant, unpleasant.
Okay.
And then activation, high, low, and then the whole thing is affect.
Okay, I see now.
Yes.
So is there a way we can control valence?
Yes.
How do we do that?
That's actually something we talked about in anatomy this year, because we kind of talked about this process of like things that you feel in your body. So like one of the things I talked about in the example with the snake, you see a snake and then your heart might start beating faster, you might feel adrenaline, but using your mind, like thinking, you can understand like, oh, that's like a tiny garden snake, or maybe it's actually a little worm, and that is not going to hurt me. So you can use reason, and you can think, even though at first your reaction was like high activation, using reason, you can tell yourself like this, I'm not actually in danger, even though my body feels like I'm in danger. And that can help you to calm down faster, and that can help you to like slow your heart rate. And yeah.
And I think it's very interesting because people oftentimes get into situations that there's high stimulation, right? And it's almost up to you to decide whether that becomes anxiety or excitement.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, it definitely
very interesting in that regard. So let's see if that can help us perhaps better understand something like anxiety. Do you think there are some people who are more sensitive to stimulation?
Yes, definitely.
So how might that play a role in the development of something like anxiety?
Well, anxiety typically, when it's occurring, you're higher up on the activation spectrum. And if you are more sensitive to stimulation like sound, or like sound, loud noises, or like flashing lights, something like that, if you are more sensitive, then you're going to go up on the activation spectrum a lot more easily than someone else, so you might experience more frequent anxiety.
Have you ever heard of any connections between this and something like introversion or extroversion?
No, I haven't, but I bet it is. I bet you could relate it.
Me and my little brother are good examples of this, because I am very introverted. I'm also very sensitive.
Yes.
Right? So if I'm not filled with adrenaline, I have a zero pain tolerance.
Okay.
Zero. So the slightest dose of medication affects me.
Okay.
So it's like there's definitely these differences in sensitivity, and he's also much more mentally stable than I am. So
It's nice for him.
it's interesting how that works out. What about faulty concepts?
That is definitely a thing. So we talk about in a lot of our classes also, we talk about like what truth is, what's the definition of truth, and it's what aligns with reality. And so you can have concepts of things that don't align with reality, and you think that that thing is true, just like you can think that like a lie is true, but in reality, it doesn't align with reality. And so ideally, we would all have concepts that are perfect and that all align perfectly with reality and they're all true, but that is definitely not the case.
So this can affect which aspect of the affective circumplex, do you think?
All of it, because concepts, we have concepts of other things. So like, say I have a concept of Mrs. Rogers, but my concept is wrong, and I think that she's super scary and mean and crazy. And so then when I see her, it affects my affect. It makes my heart beat faster. It releases adrenaline because I'm fearful. And the reason I'm fearful is my affect is changed because I have a faulty concept of who she is.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's... I mean, again, I don't have answers for these as well, so I think that's a pretty plausible explanation. It kind of makes me think of something like a spider or a snake, right? It's like the concept that this thing is, this horrible monster, but if it's not, then you can control your response. So, the next thing I want to ask, kind of going back to the discussion of Stoicism, do you think it's possible to be a Stoic? Can you really suppress or shut down this response system?
Okay, so I looked up the definition of Stoicism, partly out of fear of Jake, and the definition is, or what I found, I don't know that this is like people who consider themselves Stoics, I don't know if this is exactly what they believe, but what I found is that it's the endurance of pain or hardship without any complaint or unnecessary emotion. And so I think it is possible to do that. I don't think it's possible to... it might be possible to completely suppress your emotions. I also read about that if there were like certain disorders that allow you to be like almost completely emotionless. So I would say not completely, but you definitely can suppress a lot of them in an unhealthy way.
Because the thing that came to my mind was like alcohol, for instance. Right? Most people try to suppress that activity with alcohol because it is a depressant, so it just shuts things down. I was wondering if you could do that, if you heard of that being done just with sort of will or the mind. What might be the consequences for trying to shut it down or successfully shutting it down?
Well, because I think that we were created to feel emotion, suppressing it is probably never going to end well because that's just not how we were designed to be. And so I know for a lot of people, they can just try to like ignore or avoid all of their emotions because they don't want to feel them, and it can lead to them bottling everything up and then just having a huge mental breakdown, which is a lot worse than if they had just dealt with their emotions in a healthy way.
And it kind of makes me think that, going back to what we talked about earlier, like maybe you can have an emotion without knowing what it is. Like maybe they're still having all of these things, and then that's the buildup that you're talking about.
Yes.
That sort of, it eventually, the dam bursts. I think that's all I have for now. I would like to ask more, but we only have so much time. So thank you. I appreciate your responses.
I really want to thank you for not using me in that example of. So we've this has come up, but I don't know if we've directly addressed it. Can our emotions deceive us, and our body?
Yes.
And/or our body.
Yes, they can. So like I said, your body can deceive you by perceiving something that makes you think you're in danger, or your body perceives something as dangerous when it's not actually, and that can lead to emotions which are wrong, which are not appropriate for the situation.
Because I kept thinking of the snake example, like you're not supposed to run when you see a snake.
Exactly, yeah.
Or you see a bear, and that's not what you're supposed to do, but
Yes.
it's like our body's gearing up for us to do that.
Yes.
So why is that?
Well, for one, we have a pretty general feeling of fear, and it can feel different, but in a lot of situations that are different, that we need to react differently to, it can feel the same. So like seeing someone scary that you think might hurt you, might feel the same in your body as seeing like a bear. And even though you should probably run away from the person, and you shouldn't run away from the bear because he's going to chase you, your body might feel the same way, and it might be telling you to run both times.
Yeah, they're all faster than me, so it's kind of irrelevant. But to me, it goes back to the importance of that feel, think, act.
Yes, definitely.
Because if you just go feel, act, then you're going to get yourself in trouble. So we've talked a lot, or I think you've explained very well the whole how we construct these concepts through our life. And so how hard is it to reframe those?
It can be very difficult. It probably depends on how deeply ingrained that concept is. If it's like one of the first things you learn, like I said, like your mother or father, that is going to be a lot harder to be like changed than something that you maybe like just recently learned.
And so for people who might need to do some of that, what advice would you give them?
That is something I haven't thought about before, reframing your concepts. So you can tell them to get back to me because I don't know yet.
I would kind of think it probably depends somewhat on how serious it is.
Yes, I would think so too.
I keep thinking of like a baby whose parents aren't what they should be.
Yeah.
And like how extremely damaging to their concepts that must be.
Yes.
You know, that seems like that would take a lot of work.
It definitely would.
So this kind of goes along with the same thing. You've talked about like there's a proper emotional response and there's an improper emotional response. So how do I have to reconstruct a concept to go from that improper to proper?
I guess it depends on what is causing the improper emotional response. And so it definitely could be you have incorrect concepts. That's probably a really big one. And then another thing is just like what I kind of talked about earlier, which is that like an emotion might feel the same in different circumstances, and in one circumstance it's good and one it's not. So I think that the problem would probably be less the emotion, because that is something that just happens, but it doesn't necessarily harm things, but more what you do with it, if that makes any sense.
So I'm going to try to get real practical for like the younger students out there listening. And maybe none of these things apply to you because I didn't really know you in 7th grade. But in 7th grade, did you ever make a bad grade?
Yeah, probably.
Did it upset you?
Yes, I'm sure.
Or did a friend ever maybe say something unkind about you?
Yes.
And did it upset you?
Yes.
And so what would you tell a 7th grader? How would you tell them to have a proper emotional response and then action to those kinds of things?
I think it's okay to be emotional about those things, and I think that that can even be good, because being emotional about making a bad grade shows that you care about your grades and that you care about doing well in school, and being upset that a friend said something mean about you shows that you care about your friendships. And so those things can be good that you're feeling that, but I would say to not let yourself be consumed by it, but to let yourself feel it and then think about why you're feeling it, and then try to, maybe come up with a solution, do revisions, or talk to your friend.
Awesome. I think that's great. Well, we're pretty close to time, so I'm not going to go down any of these other avenues that I have on my paper, and I'm going to let you ask your questions.
Okay, my questions aren't that deep, like some of them are.
I was kind of scared.
Okay, that's good. Well, a lot of y'all know I really like to read. I think books are very interesting, especially C.S. Lewis. And so I want to ask what your favorite C.S. Lewis book is. And if you don't like C.S. Lewis, you can just choose a different book that's not. But also there is a right answer.
This is not my answer, but I just remembered a question I was supposed to ask you.
Okay.
I want to know how your topic relates to Till We Have Faces.
My favorite book. That was the right answer. That was the right answer. Till We Have Faces is the best book, and I wanted to read that book for my thesis so desperately, but it just wasn't necessarily like informative enough. It wasn't scientific, but that book is very very built on emotion. The whole book is kind of about bitterness. And so I thought about doing my thesis about bitterness just so that I could use that book. I would say that's the main emotion in that book.
Okay. Well, I do love that book.
It's a really good book.
It's not my favorite.
Okay, that's okay.
My favorite is Les Mis.
Okay, that's valid.
There's something about the redemption of it that really touches me.
Yeah.
And makes me emotional. And
there
so
you go.
I think that's why it's my favorite.
Very nice.
So I actually want to use this as a selfish plug to talk about one more thing real quick.
Okay.
With the attachment theory, right? Because I think that's the core of attachment theory, right? Is like bad concepts of motherhood or fatherhood, where it's like, you're touching on something that's foundational to relationships and who we are as human beings. So, I think one of the best ways people can overcome those, is learning about who the true father is.
Yes, for sure.
And for some people, it's harder to come to that, I think. For those of us who are fortunate enough to have good moms and dads, it's easier. But I think that's perhaps the only way that something that foundational can be changed. So that's a really interesting connection. How all this keeps tying back together.
Yeah.
On that note, I haven't read till we have Thesis, so I kind of feel bad about that.
That's okay. There's still time.
On something big. Your dad's sitting here, and he wants me to say A Great Divorce.
Yeah.
I know it. But it's so hard. I think when we talk about emotionality, A Grief Observed probably has had the most impact on me. Because that's really, it talks about a lot of these things. Like how it's C.S. Lewis sort of laying his heart open with the loss of his wife. And so that's, I think as far as, maybe not theologically the most significant, but as far as like the most impactful, that might be number one. So,
which I haven't read that either, so it cancels out.
It's shorter, probably.
Yeah.
Okay, I ashamedly haven't read a ton of C.S. Lewis.
That's okay.
But I have two that I really like. The first one would be Mere Christianity, because I read it when I was in high school, and I thought it was really impactful, and then read it again when I came here, and sat in on Rhetoric 1, and it hit me way harder than it even did the first time. And so he just has a lot of really cool things to say, and very pivotal. And then the other one I like is The Magician's Nephew.
Okay.
But really, it's kind of for a shallow reason, because I think the pools are really cool in the in the forest. So I love to picture it. And then Janice, is that her name? The evil witch queen, Jadis. I just think she's so creepy. I don't know. It's just a cool book.
That's valid. I respect it.
Yes. Okay.
Very nice.
Thank you so much for sharing everything. Mrs. McQueen's going to close us in prayer, and then we'll be finished.
Dear God, we thank you so much for this conversation that we've had. I thank you so much for Emma and her heart and her emotions and the things that she has taught all of us. And dear God, we pray that we'll just continue to learn from all of the great messages that we've heard this week, that most of all, we'll use it to grow closer to you and lean into you. We thank you for your grace and your mercy. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.